I think you had to be there was the message I think Biden was trying to use to explain his behavior with the segregationist senators. But you were there with regard to busing. And you talked tonight in that debate about the hurt you felt when you heard him talking about his civil, in fact, to some extent praising the civility of these old Seggies. What was the hurt?
You know, I mean, listen, if those men, those segregationists, had had their way, I would not be a member of the United States Senate, and I certainly would not be a serious candidate for President of the United States. And so the harm that they did and that they attempted to do, because frankly, they built not only their careers, but their reputation off of that, which is their quest to ensure the segregation of the races. Had they their way, there's so much that would not have happened. Lester Holt would not have been asking questions on that stage. Barack Obama would not have been in the position to appoint Joe Biden Vice President of the United States. So the consequences of their actions were very real and on the shoulders of a history in our country of really a very bad, awful, dark, dangerous, and lethal time. So, but I have to tell you, Chris, I otherwise have a great deal of respect for Joe Biden. I do not believe he's a racist, but his perspective on those senators was something that was hurtful. And it had consequences.
In the picture tonight, we saw you turn to him, look him in the eye, and almost in a way that a prosecutor has to point a finger at a defendant and said, you did these things. It was very dramatic.
Well, I mean, I felt that. Look, going back to when I was a young girl, I mean, everything I said on that stage is the truth. I grew up where the kid next door said she couldn't play with us anymore because we were black. What I said about...
You feel that still? Do you feel that memory?
Of course I do. It's the memory of a child who felt pain. I mean, I have gotten beyond it, and obviously, but I didn't let it cripple me. But it is a real emotion that a child feels based on a fact that these issues are real in our country, and we have to speak truth about it. And so that's what I was attempting to do, is speak the truth. And in a way that is also about hopefully conveying that the consequences are not only about what is wrong morally and legally with a perspective that is about segregation, as an example, but the consequences are also very painful emotionally. There was a young woman who came up to me after the debate, and she said, I'm glad that you brought that up because I was also bused. And it was also hurtful for me to hear those comments. So that's what it is.
This is really important to people of all backgrounds and ethnicities. I don't like the word race, ethnicities.
Right.
How did you come out of that and not have hatred towards white people generally?
No,
Well, I'm just asking, because you talked about it, being a kid and having other kids being kept off as friends because their parents looked at you as someone else.
Well, but, most Americans do not conduct themselves that way, and most parents don't conduct themselves that way. So there was no need to create a broad application because of that one experience. But we cannot deny that there are many children, black children in America, who have had that experience. Children of color who have had that experience, be they Latino, Asian, or black. That has happened. That happens in America.
Watching former Vice President tonight, do you feel that he had an adequate answer to you emotionally, intellectually, historically to what you were raising tonight?
I think that he, I would like to hear him acknowledge what was wrong about a perspective on busing. That was a perspective that I believe he had at that time. Yeah. Listen, we were all, busing was part of what was necessary to integrate the schools of America, and to then fall back on, well, what's the state's responsibility versus the federal government, that leaves the need to really address the fact that it was just wrong
Right.
And it dispenses with also the relevance of the federal government to step in on civil rights issues where states have failed,
right.
Which is why we had the Civil Rights
Act
he
was hedging.
And the Voting Rights Act.
You felt he was hedging.
Well, we have a different perspective on it.
Okay. Brian Williams has a thought, and so also Nicolle Wallace, who are in New York.
Hey, Senator, it's Brian. If Vice President Biden had handled it differently, used different language, would we be having this conversation? If he had said, I was one of 100 and I couldn't overturn the election results in the southern states of the people I serve with, but our job was to pass laws. Do you, for example, respect all of the personal and legislative histories of your 99 colleagues in the Senate today?
Brian, I find it difficult to relate the reputation and history and actions and words of those two individuals with my colleagues today. I strongly believe that there is not one member of the United States Senate currently who is a segregationist. Yep. So I can't make that leap.
I'll give you that one concerning their personal histories. And one question before I hand off to Nicolle that has to do with your seat on the Intelligence Committee. The president, prior to leaving for Osaka, said it was none of our business what he was going to talk about with Putin. I saw a veterans group say today, you know, you're flying on our plane, you live in our house, it's very much our business. Do you have concerns all over again for another meeting between those two happening just about the time we're having this conversation?
I do. I mean, this president has a track record of acting in a unilateral way, of not reading the briefing book, of not consulting with the leaders of our military, the leaders of our State Department, diplomats. He has a tendency to engage in foreign affairs in a way that's about his personality and ego. So he likes that the North Korean dictator flatters him with a letter, and he decides to elevate the North Korean dictator with a photo op in a summit of sorts. And then to take the word of the North Korean dictator over the word of the American intelligence community when it comes to an American student who was tortured and later died. We have a president of the United States who, by the way, is the commander-in-chief, who also prefers to take the word of a Russian president over the word of the American intelligence community when it comes to the Russians' interference in the election of the president of the United States, which the American intelligence community has been very clear did happen. We have a commander-in-chief currently who prefers to take the word of a Saudi prince over the word of the American intelligence community. When it comes to a journalist who was assassinated, a journalist who has American credentials, I absolutely have concerns about this president meeting with anyone without an adequate kind of buffer and some guarantee that he is actually going to weigh whatever he receives in that conversation in a way that is in the best interest of national security and in the best interest of the people of our country. I think we have a good track record with this president to suggest that he may not actually be the best person to have judgment about how he should engage with and negotiate with foreign leaders.
Senator Harris, I'm sure you haven't had a chance to look at all of the instant analysis to your performance tonight, but it's done. You've been declared the winner, a breakout. Joy Reid, who's really smart about all things political, says you're now sort of surging into the top tier. I wonder where you see yourself in this race and what you do next.
I am out here and will be out here working to earn the vote and the support of everyone. And this election will be given to no one. She who wins will have to earn it. And so the way that I will approach our campaign is tomorrow will be the same way it was today and the day before, which is to spend time with voters, to spend time with families, to listen, hopefully as much, if not more, than I talk. Because I'll tell you, Nicolle, I do fully intend to win this election, but my measure of our success will be also that at the end of this process, we are relevant. And I believe one of the most important ways to guarantee that is that I listen as much as I talk. And so that's the job and the task that I put before me and before our team today.
Last question, Senator. Apparently you drew blood tonight from the Biden campaign. They put out the statement after your back and forth with the vice president. They said you're doing exactly what Trump wants. Your reaction?
I certainly do not think that speaking truth about the history of segregation in our country is that. So I disagree, obviously.
Is Biden finished after tonight?
No, I don't think so. No.
In your eyes?
No, I don't think so. Listen, Vice President Biden has had a long career of dedicated public service, and he has done great things in his career. And I think he should be given credit for those things and for that work and for his dedication. I don't think anyone can question his reason for doing what he does. I do believe that he cares about people and he loves our country. So I don't think he's done, no.
Can he fix this problem that was raised tonight by you? Can he fix it?
I think his advisors and the pundits will have to figure that out.
They'll have to do it. Thank you so much, Senator.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.